Assalamu alaikum. My name is Tayyaba Nasar Khan. A very warm welcome to Newsroom. We're going to discuss three very different segments today. The first segment is going to be about the violation of human rights by India and the mention of that in the US report. This has been mentioned in the 2021, the recent report on the human rights, the country reports on human rights by the US State Department. And of course, we know that they have highlighted many things, which include the extrajudicial killings, the unlawful and arbitrary killings as well, and also the effect of the Indian government's actions on the Muslims as well as the other minority rights groups, and also of course the violence against Muslims and the killings especially in the Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, and also the fact that there is a lack of the expression, the freedom of expression, and of course the freedom of media in India now as well, which of course has been highlighted by the US State Department in itself in the report. And they've also definitely also highlighted the physical abuse that's been happening, the lynching that's been happening, and so many other human rights violations that have been happening as well. In the second, of course, our segment, we're going to talk about the Israeli-Palestine issue that's happening. Unfortunately, right now, in the last 2 weeks, we've seen a lot of killings. About 20 people have been killed in Al-AQSA Mosque, around the Al-AQSA Mosque, and the Israeli atrocities against the Palestinian people. We've seen so many lynchings, of course, and so many killings as well. And also the use of force, the use of brute force, if you could say as well, and the fact that not many international community is standing against that as well. And of course, we've also seen that dozens of Palestinians, they remained inside the building chanting that God is the greatest. And this has been happening in the district, the Hilltop compound as well in Al-AQSA Mosque as well. And we know just on Sunday right now, there was Easter as well as the Passover, and of course Ramzan is taking place as well. And despite all these three very sanctious and holy holidays collaborating on the same day of three very holy religions as well, this atrocity has been taking place in Al-AQSA Mosque right now, currently, as we speak as well. And this comes, of course, after last year's Sheikh Jarrah incident as well. Now, in the last segment, we're going to talk about the news item of course, the Ukrainian and Russian crisis, where, of course, we know that a Russian ultimatum has finished on Sunday for the city of Mariupol to surrender. And we know that, of course, the Ukraine, Kiev, the renowned Russian airstrikes, they have hit an armaments factory as well. And of course, there has been a try of the vice president of Ukraine as well to hint towards Russia to try and open the humanitarian corridor. And of course, the ultimatum that was given by Russia to surrender for the Mariupol city, a very significant city near the Baltic region as well, to surrender has finished as well. And right now, however, let's go on to our first segment, which of course was the violation of the international human rights by the Indian country. And of course, that has been mentioned in the report, the US report as well. And of course, before we move on to our guest, let's take a look at this report, which highlights what exactly the report has stated.
Religious freedom, liberty of thought, and pluralism being cardinal values are of paramount significance for democracy, but India is losing its democratic contours. The marginalization of minorities, suppression of dissent in India continues unabated as Hindu nationalist BJP government is relentlessly promoting its majoritarian agenda. Lending credence to these assertions, US State Department in its recent report painted a grim picture of human rights in India. The report cited numerous cases of extrajudicial killings, suppression of media freedom, arbitrary arrests, violence against religious minorities, and overly restrictive laws on funding of NGOs and civil society organizations. The country reports on human rights, released by Secretary of State Antony Blinken, is submitted each year to the U.S. Congress, which contains a country-wise discussion of the state of internationally recognized individual, civil, political, and worker rights, as set forth in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In a direct rebuke to Indian human rights record, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, in a joint press briefing with Indian Foreign Minister, said that U.S. is monitoring a rise in human rights abuses in India. As India hurls towards majoritarian autocracy, it's high time to hold it accountable for its callous disregard of human rights.
Of course, now we've been joined by our guests as well, which are going to join us via Skype. Mr. Najam Sheikh, who's a former ambassador, has also come on Skype with us, and Mr. Sarwar Naqvi, who's the former ambassador, has also joined us via Skype. Welcome to PETV World and welcome to Newsroom. Now, of
Thank
course,
you.
we know that the report of the U.S., which has recently been launched, has stated that India has violated human rights so many times, which of course includes the Muslim treatment, the cow vigilantes. They've also mentioned the hijab ban as well, and of course the government harassment of the domestic and international human rights organizations, the restrictions on media, the harassment of journalists themselves, and of course the treatment of the Christians, as well as extrajudicial killings and arbitrary killings as well. But not just that. We've also seen that they've mentioned the killings and the violence against the people of Kashmir as well. I'm going to go towards you, Mr. Najamuddin Sheikh. They've highlighted, the US report has highlighted the killings and, of course, the maltreatment of the people of Kashmir. Do you think this is a significant development for the people of Kashmir in themselves?
Well, you must realize that this has been going on since the 5th of August 2019. Kashmir is now under siege. Essentially, the population, the demographics are being changed, or at least an effort is being made in that direction. The new constituencies are being created, and as a result, Kashmir will no longer retain what is known as Kashmiriyat if the plan that Prime Minister Modi has is fully implemented. Right now, I think we have to focus on the fact that there are people in India who are concerned about the direction in which India's Hindutva policies are moving, and they are attempting to try and highlight the difficulties that the minorities are facing in India. But it is an uphill battle because Hindutva now appears to be something that has majority appeal. The Trinamool Congress with Banerjee leading the charge will try and stop this flow. But unfortunately, it seems that this is unlikely to happen. The Kashmiris can only look forward to a long struggle. Insofar as Pakistan and India are concerned, I think it is important for us to note that Prime Minister Modi did send a message to our new Prime Minister, Shahzad Sharif Saab, and that we had an agreement on the line of actual control and the fact that there will be no uh, that there was agreement between the military on both
Right.
sides that there will be so-called a ceasefire observed in that particular area. Now,
Right.
this is good news, but now we have to look to what is possible in the future. And one of the things that appears to me is that yeah, Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif has talked about connectivity, has talked about the fact that Pakistan's strategic location is a geoeconomic location. We are looking for connectivity. This is a message that General Bajwa has been advocating for a long time, and we have to see how we need to reconcile this. One of the ways to
Right.
do so is what Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif has suggested, that there be talks between Pakistan, as called for in various agreements, including the similar agreement for talks between uh, India and Pakistan to find a final solution to the problem, and as in another
Absolutely.
sense, also
Absolutely. Mr.
advocated
Najmuddin
that.
Sheikh will come right back at you. Let's go on towards Mr. Ali Sarwar Naqvi. Of course, we know that about 50,000 Dalits were harassed in India, and also the women of low scheduled class are also very much targeted as well. In the Delhi riots, we saw that about 73 Muslims were killed, and not just that, there are about over 2,000 arbitrary and unlawful extrajudicial killings by the Indian government as well. So do you see this step of the US highlighting the human rights abuse as a step for the international community and maybe being a leader in trying to outrightly point out towards India's atrocities?
Yes, actually, the State Department report is is very, very correct, but comes much too late. This has been happening for the last several years, at least since August 2019. And the State Department has been quiet on the atrocities, on the violation of human rights, on the uh, creeping uh, uh, progress of bigotry and intolerance in India, which has not stopped but has continued. Unfortunately, this has a uh, multiplier effect. Even the Congress party in India, which used to be known apparently for its more liberal and balanced view on communal matters, is now forced to take a stance which is in support of Hindu supremacy.
Right, we'll continue our conversation. We're going to go for a short break. We'll be right back. Right, welcome back to PTV World. We're going to continue our discussion on the first segment, that is, of course, the U.S. report on the human rights violations in India. We were continuing our discussion. Let's go on back to Mr. Ali Sarwar Naqvi. You were talking about the, of course, human rights violations in India. We also know that there's a lot of human rights violations, not just against the freedom of expression and press, because, of course, we know that there has been a lot of extrajudicial, not just abstentions and arrests, but also a lot of allegations against them. The Pegasus spyware was used, and 300 phone numbers were ousted as well over there, including the journalists and the others as well. And of course, we also know that the human rights organizations, including the Human Rights Watch and of course the Amnesty International, they have been targeted as well. And the Mother Teresa's funding was also stopped. So what is all of this Indian government's plans to stop the human rights organizations from working and the journalists working within the country? Is it a try to put it under the carpet, to try to oust the expression and the impression and give the impression to the world that India is still a human rights abiding country?
See, it's so difficult to pick out what irregularity, what violation, what kind of total disregard of the respect for human rights, freedom, liberty of expression, and the right of minorities to live their lives unhindered and unhampered. The whole range of rights and opportunities to be allowed has been violated on a massive scale. And this is most unfortunate. India has been doing all this without any censure by the international community. So I think the human rights report of the State Department is a step in the right direction, but it's a very small recognition of this massive disregard of both international law and constitutional law and civil liberties. So India, I think, is getting away with far too much in terms of such violations. And unless the international community exercises its influence over India to stop it from carrying out these policies, the lives and the rights of people living in India are severely jeopardized.
Right. Mr. Ali, you've rightly mentioned that India is getting away with far too much. Mr. Najam Sheikh, of course, we know that India-US relations have been, of course, escalating for the past few years that we've seen as well. But, however, the Ukrainian crisis, the Russian invasion in Ukraine, has caused US to try and put a pressure on India, but India is not taking it as well. And there is, of course, we know that 50% of the imports, defense imports of India is from Russia, and the US recognizes that as well. But then there's China on one hand, and they want India to help in containing China as well. Do you think the human rights issue is a try to, is a wish, of US to pressurize India into trying not to take a very outward stand on Russia's invasion, or maybe siding with Russia completely?
Well, let me put it this way that, in foreign policy, you do pay attention to your values. And the United States talks about human rights and about protecting human rights as an essential value that it wants to protect, not only in the United States itself, but in all countries all over the world. And that is really the crux of why this human rights report is prepared. But at the same time, one must recognize that the reality that India is currently very important in the American context of containing China, and therefore not just containing China, but perhaps having to confront China, and therefore that perhaps has higher priority in the American foreign policy decisions than the protection of human rights. And that is what we are seeing in practice, that while you have a 2+2 meeting in which the subject is raised, but the rest of the discussion tends to focus on what the Indian team wanted, including references to Pakistan and including references to irreversible, the demand for irreversible steps by Pakistan to contain the so-called terrorist organizations, proscribed terrorist organizations that have found shelter in Pakistan, or are alleged to have found shelter in Pakistan. Now, these are what I call the realities of foreign policy. You try and serve that interest which you regard as most important first, and you may sacrifice other interests or even values in doing so. And for today, I think in American foreign policy, the containment of China, or it's more than a containment, it's more of a confrontation, it's a strategic competition.
Right.
They want India by itself to be on their side, and therefore they are prepared to not only concede or set aside human rights, but even to raise questions with regard to India's relations within its
Absolutely. Mr.
neighborhood
Najam,
and with Pakistan.
absolutely. In continuation of what you rightly pointed out right now, you basically first of all mentioned that human rights is intrinsic in values. And right now we've seen that the US is, of course, has a huge defense deal with India. And of course, we know that they're increasing their cooperation in cyber field, in space technology, and in artificial intelligence and whatnot. And of course, they want to increase the Quad relationship as well, which of course, as you rightly mentioned, was mentioned in the 2+2 dialogue as well. And this is moving India and US bilateral relation to a front which is not only limited to human rights. So do you think that the human rights issues will be able to make an impact on their other bilateral issues?
Well, this is just the point I'm trying to make. That I think the American establishment, Secretary Blinken, President Biden, have attribute importance to the human rights as a value that the Americans seek to promote not only in their own country but elsewhere in the world. But this takes second place to the priority they attach to the confrontation or the strategic competition with China and the role that they have attributed to India in this particular respect. The Indians have received protests from America about their purchases of or their Russian rupee ruble arrangements, and frankly, the Indians have been quite cocky about saying that look, the purchases that we are making are less than one day purchase that is being made by the Europeans themselves from Russia. Secondly, they keep stressing the fact that they have an old relationship with Russia, that 69% of their military equipment came from Russia. This number is now diminishing, but it is still an important component, and this is not a component that they are prepared to forswear, because like systems like the S-400, apart
Absolutely.
their entire military contingent is based largely on what their agreements with Russia have
Absolutely,
been
and
in the past.
CATSA has not been implemented on India despite the buying of S-400. Now let's go back to Mr. Ali Sarwar Naqvi. Lastly, just briefly, I want to, we've lost contact with Mr. Ali Sarwar Naqvi and Mr. Najamuddin Sheikh. Thank you for joining us and in our first session. Now let's talk about the second segment, which of course has been happening for decades. It's a very long issue that still prevails. And unfortunately, in the international society, this issue, despite being highlighted since the past year, a little more than it was highlighted earlier, there has been, of course, reports of censorship, of course, reports of violations, and many say that this could account to genocide as well. The Israeli-Palestinian issue remains alive since a very, very long time. Let's take a look at this report and come back with more.
The unabated bloodshed in the occupied Palestine continues as Israel escalates its imperial ambitions. After a string of deadly violence, Israeli forces raided the Al-AQSA mosque compound in occupied East Jerusalem again, as thousands of worshippers were gathered at the mosque for early morning prayers. 2 days after detaining hundreds at the Jerusalem's flashpoint, more than 20 Palestinians were wounded in fresh spate of violence. Al-AQSA Mosque is the third holiest site in Islam and the holiest for Jews, who refer to it as the Temple Mount, so it has long been a flashpoint for Israeli-Palestinian violence. Amid Jerusalem tensions, several demonstrations held across the occupied Palestine territories to mark Palestinian Prisoners' Day, an occasion on which Palestinians traditionally show solidarity with those held in Israeli prisons. More than 4,400 Palestinians are currently held in Israeli jails. More than 500 detainees, including women and minors, are held in administrative detention, under which suspects are held without charge or trial for an indefinite period of time. Raids by Israeli security forces on Al-AQSA compound, attacks on worshippers, and the attempted eviction of the Palestinian families from Jerusalem's Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood during last year's Ramadan triggered eruption of Israel's 11-day bloody offensive on the Gaza Strip in May.
Right, you just looked at the report where you saw that about 36 Palestinians have been killed and more than 400 detained in and arrested by the Israeli prisons as well. And not just that, we've seen also the occupation forces trying to occupy most of East Jerusalem. And not just that, earlier last year, we saw Sheikh Jarrah under constant occupation of the Israeli forces as well, and the Israeli Defense Forces we've seen many videos coming up online as well, with children seeing their own fathers and their own parents being hit and of course violated by the Israeli Defense Forces as well. And not just that, there was also a surfacing of a video where they saw that in Al-AQSA Masjid, many women were of course shut down in the compound and they were not being allowed to come out. And these images we've seen are causing an uproar in the international community now, when the social media page and the social media digital age has loomed, and also the zooming of this age has shown us many important and permanent activists coming up as well, including many models as well as many activists such as Muhammad al-Kurd, such as Bella Hadid, and such as many others as well. And they've been coming up and they've been trying to talk about it as well. And to talk more about this, however, we're going to go towards our guest, Mrs. Sami Hamdi, who's the MD of the International Interest via Skype. Welcome to PTV World.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Mr. Sami Hamdi, we know that the Israeli atrocities against the Palestinians have been going for a very long time. But however, in the past couple of weeks, this has exacerbated again, especially after Mr. Naftali Bennett has accused the the Palestinians in trying to, having a collision with the ISIL as well. What is the cause of these recent violence and the perpetration of violence by the Israeli forces?
I think there's an immediate cause, and there is a cause that is exacerbated in the wider context. I think the first thing is that the Ramadan and the Jewish festival of Passover coincide at the same time, and some of the far right of the Jewish population have insisted that they perform their sacrifices inside the mosque of Al-Aqsa, and even sent out an offer on social media saying they would award prize money to anybody who would be able to actually walk into the Al-Aqsa mosque and perform a sacrifice under the Jewish ceremony of Passover, insisting that this was part of what they considered to be religious freedoms. When this group essentially was allowed to provoke the Muslim worshippers during the month of Ramadan in Al-Aqsa with the oversight of the Israeli occupation police forces, this provoked a response from the Muslim worshippers who saw the Al-Aqsa mosque then stormed by the Israeli police, as the Israeli police tried to essentially blame the Palestinians for this provocation instead of the far right of the Jewish population, who sought to provoke and knew that this was going to happen even before they sought to perform their sacrifice inside the mosque of Al-Aqsa, which is contrary not only to Passover but also contrary to the basic agreements of freedom of religion that Israel is expected to uphold, even if it is an occupation force and an apartheid regime. But in the wider context, it's important to look at this from the perspective of what the regime, the apartheid regime in Tel Aviv, is trying to achieve, which is to try to make life as unbearable as possible for the Palestinians so that they willingly leave Jerusalem and leave it for the Tel Aviv regime to alter the demographics of the regime of Jerusalem by pushing in more settlers into that Jerusalem area, whereby they will be able to achieve their long-term goal of destroying the Al-Aqsa Mosque and building the Temple of Solomon over it instead. The idea being that what the regime, the apartheid regime in Tel Aviv, is trying to achieve more than anything else is to ensure that every tiny affair of the Palestinian, whether it's their fasting in Ramadan, whether it's going to the markets to buy goods, whether it's traveling in and between different people's houses, the regime in Tel Aviv has set up checkpoints in order to make movement difficult. It's set up random checks to make life unbearable, all in order to try to push this narrative that when they move into Jerusalem, it will be because the Palestinians left, not because they violently forced them out. The idea being that the apartheid regime is trying to build this story that it wants to present, and that it's been frustrated by the doggedness of the Palestinians who insist on digging their heels in and staying in the Jerusalem area, staying in their homes, refusing to accept the intimidation of the apartheid regime. This is why we're seeing this provocation take place. The regime in Tel Aviv watching this escalation, trying to make sure it doesn't result in war, given that it doesn't want to provoke something like what happened last year, given that the Gaza war last year affected Israel's relationship with the US and affected Israel's relationship with the EU. But the idea here being that this is part of a concerted effort to make life unbearable for the Palestinians, to force them to leave, and the Palestinians refuse to leave. They will not leave, and that's why what we're seeing from Israel is not a manifestation of power, but rather an expression of desperation and frustration to try to get the Muslims or try to get the Palestinians to leave the Jerusalem area.
Absolutely. We've seen that multiple times, as well as last year in Sheikh Jarrah when they were occupying the houses of the Palestinians as well. Now we know that all of this is against the international human rights violations, against the international norms, and against the international law, against the Geneva Convention and so many others. We've seen the Nuremberg trials against those who, of course, who violated the, in the Holocaust, who violated the sanctity of the people, of the Jews themselves. And right now we've seen the sanctity of Palestinians being violated continuously. Do you think such Nuremberg type trials will be able to be held against these atrocities later on?
I think in generations to come, I think there will be Nuremberg trials for the manner in which the Israeli occupation has treated the Palestinians, the way it has stolen land, the way it has implemented an apartheid regime, and that there will be many evidence to document that, not only evidence from the Palestinians, but also a recognition on the part of human rights organizations such as Human Rights Watch, such as Amnesty International, who are now using the terms of apartheid, albeit 70 years too late, but using the terms of apartheid now to refer to the Israeli regime, to refer to the apartheid regime in Israel. We're seeing the word apartheid now being used in Congress by the members of Congress that include the likes of Ilhan Omar and others. We're seeing now articles come out such as those in the New York Times last year by Nicholas Kristof, who described or who stated that the Israeli-US relationship is no longer unshakable. The idea here being that the social media activism that you referred to earlier has resulted in this change of narrative, has broken Israel's monopoly over the discourse course, has resulted in a change in which the international opinion views what is taking place in Israel and Palestine. And that is why we see an emboldened Palestinian movement. Even if perhaps we see Muslim governments seeking reconciliation with Tel Aviv, we're still seeing Palestinians and Palestinian people, the Palestinian movements, insisting that they will continue to fight for their rights, to fight for justice, to fight for one state with equal rights for all, something that the apartheid regime in Tel Aviv absolutely does not want to do, because in the words of Bernie Sanders, the congressman in the US, if there is equal rights for all, then the Palestinians as the larger demographic would democratically take control of what is today known as Israel. The idea here being that I do think Nuremberg's trials in generations to come, they will take place, primarily because the reality is that oppression doesn't last and justice eventually comes, and also because we're seeing the shift, we're seeing the shift in attitudes, we're seeing the shift in international opinion, we're seeing the shift in the way in which Israel's relationship with its allies is being conducted. All of this alludes to that even if perhaps it's taking some time, we will get there eventually. And as an Algerian with my grandfather who fought the French in order to kick the French out of the French, which was the colonial power in Algeria, 132 years France were in Algeria. Eventually they were kicked out. Eventually Algeria got their independence. Eventually France would essentially leave Algeria completely. The idea being that even if it is taking a while, it will get there eventually.
Right. Now, Sami, of course, we've talked about the social media activism as well. And there is, as you've highlighted, that a lot of social media activists coming up and trying to raise awareness amongst the masses, amongst people like you and me, and others who do not have a lot of awareness about what's happening inside Palestine by, ousting the videos, the common videos of the common people who are seeing what's happening in front of their eyes and the atrocity that are happening in front of the eyes. However, many are claiming, and many sources say, that the algorithms of many big social media platforms are trying to ensure that these websites and these videos are not exactly going to the masses as much as the others are. So they're trying to curb this and censor out these the highlighting of these social media activists. What do you have to say about that? Is this true if it's happening?
I think that it's true that many of the accounts are being shadow banned by Instagram, by Facebook and others. Shadow ban being that their posts are being limited in terms of the reach that they can achieve, even if a page has thousands or hundreds of thousands of followers, such as the likes of Bella Hadid or others. But I do think that it's important to note also that last year, during the aggression against Al-AQSA, during the bombardment of Gaza, Benny Gantz, the Israeli defense minister, summoned the directors of Facebook, TikTok and the likes. He gathered with them on an online meeting, asking and imploring them to take down Palestinian content. In other words, a recognition that this social media battle that they were fighting, that some people ignorantly say has no relevance, this social media battle was being decided heavily in favor of the Palestinians, to the extent that Benny Gantz was summoning the directors of these social media accounts and telling that to the social media of Facebook and TikTok that they should remove pro-Palestinian content. The reality is that while Instagram and Facebook have been trying to shadow ban, it's been 1 year and they've still been unsuccessful in trying to remove content on Palestine, primarily because the damage has already been done. As a result of the social media war that took place last year, that coincided with the bombardment of Gaza and the storming of Al-AQSA, the narrative has already shifted. Amnesty and Human Rights Watch are now using apartheid in their reports. They're using that term now. That's as a result of the social media. The damage has been done for the Israeli occupation.
Despite the lobby being very strong, the damage has been done. Now, lastly, Sami, very, very briefly, I want to ask, of course, there was a summit held between the many Arab countries as well under the Abraham Accords, whereby so many Arab countries have established contact and the diplomatic relations with Israel as well. And this aggression, when it started, there was a summit happening amongst the Arab countries. Do you think this has any significance and a message that could be given that Palestine does not have much backing anymore?
I think that if you're sitting in Tel Aviv and you are a member of the apartheid regime, if let's suppose for imagination's sake, you will see that Erdogan is chasing you for reconciliation. You're seeing that Saudi Arabia is signaling that it's willing to engage with normalization. UAE has normalized. Morocco has normalized. Egypt is looking for friendship because it's under pressure from Biden. The idea here being that all of these states, Turkey and the like, are all suggesting that the issue of Palestine does not need to compromise their relations with Israel. And this was was stated as much by Turkey, by the UAE, by Morocco, the idea being that Palestine issue can be separate from their relations with Israel, and it doesn't need to affect their relations with Israel. When we look at other countries such as Malaysia, even such as Pakistan and the others, while we have official statements, the internal political infighting has resulted in an inability to really focus on presenting that united front that perhaps we saw Imran Khan or Mahathir Mohamad or the others before them produced it in the past. The idea
Thank you, Mr. Sami Hamdi, for joining us, the MD of International Interest as well. Thank you for highlighting the atrocities that are, of course, happening and the apartheid that's happening in Palestine against the people of Palestine by the Israeli Defense Forces as well. Now let's go on to our last news item, which of course is regarding the Russian-Ukrainian crisis, where of course we know that a Russian ultimatum to surrender the Mariupol city, where the ammunitions factory over there, the Azovstal ammunitions factory, of course they have not surrendered yet to Russia, and the ultimatum was given on Sunday to, of course, at 1 p.m. to evacuate as well and to lay down their arms at 6 a.m. Moscow time, and the Ukrainians have still not surrendered yet. And according to the Russian sources rather, they're saying that the Kiev has been told to, of course, shoot down anyone who tries to surrender as well. On the contrary, there are different differing opinions on this as well by the Ukrainian Kiev people as well. And of course, we know that in Kiev, renewed airstrikes have also started by Russia as well, which of course hit an armament factory in the city of Kiev as well, in the eastern Donbas region, where they gained control as well. And of course, the Russia's defense ministry has stated, quote unquote, during the night, high precision air-launched missiles destroyed an ammunition factory near the settlement of the Brovary in Kiev region. Hence, we can see that the escalation still continues to take place. Of course, the ultimatum could not go on to much further de-escalation of the issues that are happening currently in the crisis. And of course, this has been happening for about 2 months as well. And of course, we know that the Ukrainian president has also said that if Russia forces kills the Ukrainian troops, the humanitarian corridors are not open, then of course these peace talks which were trying to take place will not be able to take place. These were all the 3 topics that we discussed in today's episode of Newsroom. Keep watching Newsroom for more, and PTV World for more details. We'll join you again tomorrow. Thank you.